Good morning, church. Thank you for joining this video this morning. This is my first attempt at trying to do something like this. I know some of you are probably not comfortable with technology to the point that you can get on here. Maybe somebody's helped you. We are exploring the best ways to do this. Let me say a couple of things about what's happening. First of all, we are taking our church situation 1 week at a time. Myself and the leadership, we are carefully watching the news. We are listening, making sure we have the details, the facts straight. This situation is very fluid. It's changing even as we speak. This week, which is going to be the 22nd, March 22nd, as I record this on Friday, there have, as of yet, been no confirmed cases of the coronavirus in Burke County. There has been one in Catawba. So we are expecting things to change. These numbers are going to go up. And the leadership and myself, we love you. We are concerned about you. We have many folks in our congregation who really, I believe, and I'm not a doctor, but I believe could not withstand this disease, this virus, not this infection. I don't think they could handle it. So out of concern for them, out of concern for all of us, I said the other day that I myself, I'm not worried about catching it. I'm not afraid of dying. But the truth is, and I've heard others say this, man, that I look up to, and I think this makes sense. I would rather suffer from it myself than to know I passed it to someone else. And the scriptures are clear to us that we are to be obedient to governments when they have our best interests at heart and in mind, and I think in this case they do. So we're going to do our best to try to take care of you, which at this moment means there will be no meeting of any kind through this coming Wednesday night. We will make another determination after the weekend, at the beginning of the week, and then we'll be making announcements via one call. I can do Facebook Live announcements. I can do that. I can also post to this YouTube channel. If you have found it, then we are here. And listen, we're trying to navigate through this, and I want to thank everybody who's helped me with this. So basically, I want to tell you that we love you. And I trust that you are praying for each other. You folks are the most important people in the world to me. And I hope you know that. Also, this is an unbelievable time to be a Christian. I'm going to say something about that at the end of our short Bible study here. But this is an opportunity for us to show Christ to the world. It's not a time to be dramatic in our patriotism. It's not a time to be defiant in our patriotism. It's a time to use common sense. And by the way, that's how God has called us to follow Him, is with our mind as well as our heart. And so I encourage you to find ways to minister to other people. If there are folks in the community that you know their family is not in a position to take care of them, if you cannot meet the need, let me know or let the church office know, leave a message either place, and we will see to it. We'll do our best to see to it that needs are met. And especially if there's anyone in our congregation who is going without, I mean, listen, it's crazy out there. I understand that. But there may come a point where we need to share some things, and that's going to require our a strong Christian ethic and love for each other. I know you have that, so keep your keep your ears open, keep your eyes open to the needs in the community, and let leadership, let any of us know if we need to do something. Please do that. Just because we have suspended our gathering times does not mean we have suspended our ministry. Hospital visitation is sort of a non-factor right now. If you're in the hospital, please let me know. I'll do my best to contact you and to if I can to see you. But many healthcare organizations have a no visitation policy other than one person in the family. And I don't think I need to be that one person, because there's no switching off. Once you designate someone, that person has to remain as the designated visitor. So keep that in mind and embrace this opportunity to be a Christian. I think you'll see what I'm talking about when we get into our Bible study in just a moment now. Thank you again for your cooperation. Again, be listening for announcements via this YouTube channel, one call announcements, and possibly Facebook Live. Oh, and by the way, if you have a Sunday school class and your classes are capable, the members of your classes are capable of using technology, think about doing a Facebook group, some kind of a Facebook Live broadcast. It's not that difficult. Many of you are on social media. You can make a group, invite your members to join. I have done that with my young married class, and of course they're in their 20s and they can teach us all how to do things. But I'm gonna teach Sunday school with those guys watching live. That's the plan. And I should have already done that by this, maybe by the time you're hearing this. So thank you again for your cooperation. Again, we love you. Pray for each other. Pray for each other, please. And I'll be back at the end of our Bible study, and I'll pray with you, and we'll pray for each other, okay? James chapter 5, verse number 7. James writes, "Be patient, therefore, brethren, unto the coming of the Lord. Behold, the husbandman," that is the farmer, "waits for the precious fruit of the earth, and has long patience for it, until he receives the early and latter rain. But be ye also patient. Establish your hearts." That means strengthen them. "For the coming of the Lord draweth nigh. Grudge not one against another, brethren, lest you be condemned. Behold, the judge stands before the door. Take, my brethren, the prophets who have spoken in the name of the Lord, for an example of suffering, affliction, and of patience. Behold, we count them happy which endure. You have heard of the patience of Job, and have seen the end of the Lord, that the Lord is very pitiful and of tender mercy." Patience in times of trial. Wow. Well, you remember that James has just got finished speaking to those who had been guilty of taking advantage and even of oppressing the poor. In some cases, they were not only oppressing them, they were condemning them, possibly even to death by a sentence in the courts. I can imagine James as he turns, if he were sitting in the room there, from those who were professing Christians who were rich and oppressing the less fortunate. He turns then to those who were the oppressed, and he has a message for them. He doesn't tell them to be defiant. He doesn't tell them to be destructive. Instead, he tells them to be patient. Someone has said that there are two kinds of trouble in a believer's life. There is ordinary, inevitable trouble, and there is trouble that comes from persecution. Well, I think all of us would agree that we are experiencing the first kind of trouble, ordinary, inevitable trouble. Christians are affected by this as much as are unbelievers. We'll talk about it in just a second, but it's wrong for us to pull ourselves out of the world and think that this is anything other than an ordinary, inevitable kind of trouble. Think about this. You can almost hear Job declaring that man is born for trouble as sparks fly upward. He said that in chapter 5, verse 7. You can maybe hear Jesus warning his followers that in the world you will have tribulation. That is, you will have trouble. And I want to remind you, folks, that Jesus never promised that any of us as Christians would in any way be exempt from ordinary trouble. I need to remind you, we live in a world of sin. Why is the coronavirus rampant now? It's a product of sin, not someone's specific intentional sin, perhaps, but it's the product of the fact that we live in a sinful, fallen world. Sickness is a result of our fallenness. There are viruses that steal our health. They are results of the fall. We live in a world that is corrupted by sin. Jesus never promised that we would be exempt from any of that. I know I've heard some people, and I've seen folks on social media who have talked about Jesus being our shield from what's going on right now. I saw one person had a meme up that said Jesus' blood shields us from the coronavirus. Well, how sad of a misinterpretation that is. What if one of their saved loved ones dies from illness caused by this virus? What's the theology going to be then? Ladies and gentlemen, we've got to remember we live in a world of sin. We are subject to many of these same symptoms of the fall, all of the same symptoms of the fall that the world is as we live here. I mean, what's the basic cause of these kinds of things? It's sin. What's the basic cause of hoarding and selfishness? It's sin. What causes us to be afraid even though we trust and believe in God? Well, it's sin. Sin is the fact that we still carry the remnant of our old sin nature as believers, and that's what fights against our faith that trusts in God. Our old sin nature continues to fight and scream and kick, if you will. That second kind of trouble is more of what James has in mind, most likely. Jesus warns that and told his followers, if they persecuted me, they will persecute you. He said that in John 15. Now, James knew it would be hard for believers to always respond correctly to those kinds of trials caused by persecution. If you'll remember, even the great apostle Paul, perhaps the greatest Christian apart from the Lord Jesus himself, responded to being struck in the mouth at his arrest in Jerusalem by calling the high priest a whitewashed wall. I don't think Paul said that in a calm voice. I think he was angry, and I think he was vengeful. And if you remember, he felt it in his heart. I think it was the Holy Spirit that caused him actually even to apologize for that. James knew that it was all too easy for believers to react wrongly to trials of either kind, either normal, ordinary trouble, tribulation, or trials brought about by persecution. He knew that. So, what does James say for believers to do in the face of trials? Well, it's pretty simple. I'll remind you again what he says in verse 7. Be patient. He says it again in verse 8. Be you also patient. Now, in my study Bible, the one I have open here, it has the equivalent of that as being endurance. Now, James has already mentioned endurance in chapter 1. We know that, but this is a different word than that one. And I'll explain that in a second. The word he uses here in verses 7 and 8 is a word which comes from two words. The two words individually mean long and anger. If we were to put them together, we would render the combination of those two words in English perhaps as long-tempered. So I told you that James has already mentioned this idea of endurance in chapter 1, verses 3 through 4. But if you remember, what James was talking about there had more to do with trying circumstances. And so, knowing this, he said that the trying of your faith worketh patience. Again, there's that word in patience or endurance. Let patience have her perfect work, that you may be perfect and entire, wanting nothing. That's a different word than he uses in chapter 5. And that has to do with trying circumstances. The word he uses in chapter 5 has to do more with dealing with trying people. In other words, I think he is talking about patience and persecution. And by the way, both of those kinds of patience or endurance, whether it be trying circumstances or dealing with trying people, is a test of faith. So how do we apply this? Well, I want to ask you a question. What does your patience in times of trying circumstance or while dealing with trying people reveal about your faith? Now's an awfully good time to ask ourselves about the state of our faith, isn't it? Are you afraid? Is there fear? Or do you see the Holy Spirit working in your life, producing patience, the kind of patience that James is talking about here? Now, later on when we pick this back up, he's going to mention and point out about 6 ways that our patience in times of trial is actually defined. And more so, maybe we will look at that as a lens through which we can see how our patience is borne out and the context in which our patience is developed. And we'll do that when we come back. But let me say this to you before we go. So I think you see, just from that very brief introduction to this new passage in James, that every Christian is called upon to exercise patience in time of trial. Now, in the case of our passage, it was in time of persecution. But you have to remember, earlier James told us to endure. And I think all of us are learning something about ourselves as we're walking through this. So think spiritually. Think spiritually. Let me share a couple of things with you. I came across this. I'm going to read it for you. Martin Luther, the great leader of the Reformation, initial leader of the Reformation, during the bubonic plague in Europe, was serving. And here's what he wrote. I want you to listen to what he wrote. I'm just going to read it for you. He said, "I shall ask God mercifully to protect us. Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance inflict and pollute others and so cause their death as a result of my negligence." Wow. "If God should wish to take me, he will surely find me, and I have done what he has expected of me, and so I am not responsible for either my own death or the death of others. If my neighbor needs me, however, I shall not avoid place or person, but will go freely. See this as a God-fearing faith, because it is neither brash nor foolhardy, and does not tempt God." Another instance. This was earlier than when Luther was serving. In the 3rd century, there was a pandemic that swept across Italy. You know, the Roman Empire was still in existence. It swept across Italy, Africa, and the Western Roman Empire. Some scholars think this was Ebola back then. It might have been. It killed at its height around 5,000 people every day in Rome. Some cities had their population wiped out by more than 60%. Now, we're not seeing this, but listen to what happened. During the pandemic, people panicked. They panicked. Many people abandoned the sick and dying in ditches, left their corpses unburied. People fled areas where there was sickness, abandoned the elderly, the sick, and the disabled. But there was one class of people who refused to panic. The last non-Christian emperor of the Roman Empire was a man by the name of Julian. Here's what he wrote. He said that the recent Christian growth was caused by their moral character, even if pretended, and by their benevolence toward strangers and care for the graves of the dead. In a letter to another priest, he wrote, the impious Galileans, and by that he meant Christians, support not only their poor, but ours as well. Everyone can see that our people lack aid from us. But Christians, the historians tell us, instead of leaving the city, stayed at great risk to themselves. They cared for the poor, the sick, and the elderly. One historian has said that he can trace the rise of Christianity to the 3 major plagues of the 2nd, 3rd, and 6th century. He said Christianity grew because people looked at the incredible witness of Christians during times of crisis. Instead of panicking, they demonstrated tremendous faith and compassion. So, if you are a believer, as I, you have an opportunity to not panic, to be patient, to have compassion, and not just make a difference, but to show Christ to the world. We have no reason to panic. We have no reason to fear. If God should take us, as Luther said, if he wants to take us, he knows where to find us. If we're his, that's okay. I love you. Be patient. Be patient in the Lord.